Asia Tech Podcast with Graham Brown and Michael Waits.
Hello and welcome to Asia Tech Podcast Stories. My name is Graham Brown. Today we are going to journey into the world of biotech. And we're going to learn about bioinformatics, which uses software to help us better understand biological data. We're going to learn about the current drug discovery process. And to do that, we're joined by a PhD in Genome Science here in Tokyo, Eli Lyons, CEO of Tupac Bio. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, there's so much that we need to talk about, and just diving into that world of biotech. I mean, people are familiar with what biotech is about. I mean, they've heard the name, but maybe people don't actually understand what goes on behind the scenes. So we're really going to go a bit deeper into that so people can understand it, especially how technology helps people in that area, understand biological data, drug discovery process, and how you're solving problems which exist in that whole industry. We'll also understand a little bit about how you got into that, because you're an engineer by background, right? And you got into the medical industry, the biotech industry. So there's an interesting narrative there. Let's talk about Tupac Bio first. What is it that you do, and what is the problem that you're trying to solve there, Eli?
Yeah, so we're creating software for biologists, genetic engineers, and I like to just say, we're creating a tool set that's similar to the tool set that graphic designers may use in graphic design. So the analogy would be like Adobe Illustrator is to graphic designers as Tupac Bio is to biologists. Or like for engineers, Digital IC design, they use very specialized tools to design computer chips, and we're making very advanced specialized tools for biologists to design proteins and even in the future genomes.
Okay. So help us understand this, because designing proteins, is that a thing? I don't understand. I mean, I understand everything that you put together there, but I didn't know biologists actually design proteins.
Yeah, so, well, first let me start with a little background of biotech, especially drug development. So I think a lot of people think that all new drugs or like cancer drugs are chemical compounds, and they used to be mostly chemical compounds, small molecules. But a lot of, in the past decade, a lot of new drugs are antibody-based or protein-based, or antibody drug conjugates, where it's a protein connected with a small molecule. But basically, that means that a lot of the new cancer drugs, or in other areas as well, biologists are doing protein engineering. But so the point is, you can design or make proteins that have the function you want. That, for example, in drug engineering, you may design a protein that binds to a receptor that's more common on cancer cells than healthy cells.
Right.
And designing that is a little bit of like trial and error, and designing things or just testing things even without very rational design methods. But it is something that's very important and common in biotech.
So let's understand here. What you said was previously the world of biotech or drug discovery or drug synthesis was pretty much involving building, creating, designing chemical compounds. But in the last 10 years, it's shifted to, organic compounds, proteins. And the reason being is that sort of more easily absorbed by the body, more easily integrated into a biological system?
Yeah, so I'm actually not familiar with the small molecule chemical compounds very well, but previously, and still people use those. You can create a library of million chemical compounds and test them against cancer cells and see which ones kills the cancer cells, for example. But I believe a lot of them aren't very effective and also targeted. And the advantage of antibody drug conjugates, for example, is you can design a protein that's very targeted and attach like a toxic material to go along with that antibody. But there's a lot of new therapeutic methods as well. Like a really hot one right now is immunotherapy, which is taking your immune cells. You can take immune cells out of someone's body, for example, and you can genetically engineer the immune cells to target cancer cells and then put them back in the patient's body. And so there's a lot of new therapies that are taking advantage of protein engineering or genetic engineering to treat cancer in a more targeted and effective way.
What's enabled that in the last 10 years? Is it simply an increase in computational power, access to new technologies, or is it a new way of thinking, approaching the whole area of drug discovery and drug synthesis?
So I think even 20 years or more, they had some technologies to screen for proteins that had the characteristics you wanted, but those technologies have just been getting better iteratively, and there's been a lot of improvements, for example, antibody technologies in the last 20 years, through generating different kinds of protein libraries, for example, for testing. And there's a lot of different protein libraries, and the testing methods get better. And you get better at bonding the protein with a chemical compound, for example. But our company, if I can just kind of shift a little bit, our company is really trying to take advantage of two changes in biology and synthetic biology, which is improvements in DNA sequencing technologies and improvements in DNA synthesis technology. So DNA sequencing, I think some people are familiar with that, but basically just reading the DNA sequence, A, T, G, C, T, 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 right? The machines, the equipment that allows you to read someone's DNA has been improving at a rate that's faster than Moore's law. And so that's already becoming more common and cheaper to do. And then our company is trying to take advantage of DNA synthesis technology improvements, which is being able to write DNA. So being able to synthesize DNA in a lab, being able to manufacture DNA in a lab at will.
Right.
And that's a technology that a lot of other companies are improving recently, and we believe that it will also, improve very rapidly in the next. It's already improving very rapidly, but it will continue to do so.
That would be DNA synthesis, as you mentioned.
Yes.
Right? Okay. So would that be most relevant in immunotherapy, as you mentioned? Or I'm just curious to know what would be the tangible impact of this kind of technology here today in the average patient's life?
Right. So for both of I think both of those technologies, DNA sequencing and writing DNA synthesis, are going to have an impact on patients' lives. For the sequencing side, the DNA sequencing has allowed biologists, researchers to collect a lot more data. So, for example, we've been able to sequence lots of different patients' tumor cells and tumors, and that has provided a lot of data and allowed researchers to start to gain insight into what are the common patterns between, for example, 1,000 patients' brain tumors, right? Because each patient may have some slightly different mutations, but when you sequence 1,000 different patients, you start to see some patterns, possibly, right, among the mutations that different patients have. So that's a pattern in DNA sequencing technology, or something that DNA sequencing technology has helped with. And for DNA synthesis is going to allow us to, write sequences that code for proteins at will. So whenever we want to try a new protein structure, for example, we could design it in software and then immediately test it. Or if we want to design a whole pathway of genes, meaning genes that are having some interaction with each other, we could design that in software and then write it as DNA and test it in a lab and see how that pathway functions.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's a fascinating area, and I don't claim to know anything about this area. So what I want to do is ask the questions for the listeners who are really curious about what you're doing and the problem that you're solving. And, not sort of, I suppose, assume any kind of knowledge on our behalf as well, because it's so important that, people hear about these terms that you mention, but people don't really know what goes on. So we'll sort of dive a little bit deeper into that in a minute to understand exactly what you're doing and the kind of problems that you're solving, because it's absolutely fascinating. Go back to, you mentioned tumors as an example. So here's what I'm interested in. I mean, from a personal angle, not myself personally, but a family member had a history of brain tumor. And what was kind of fascinating about that was how little the medical community actually knew in this particular case about the origins of it. Nobody knows how people actually get, in this case, it was GBM multiform, right? Which is kind of common, but extremely aggressive. But, given all the technology that they have, they knew so little about how it actually happened. And also, the unfortunate flip side of that is the prognosis is very poor because there's no sort of known longer term cure for it, right? Is that sort of a function of not understanding, kind of going down to the gene level that you're talking about? What's missing there to really make that, because there are some cancers, I guess, with a very successful cure rate, right? But with that, for example, what do you know? Is that something that this can solve long term?
Yeah, so it's a coincidence that I actually happened to study GBM a little bit in my research in university. And so I'd love to go through that as an example of how biologists do research, right?
Please, yeah.
And so, for example, my senpai, my supervisor, what he did to study brain tumors was he genetically engineered. So the first thing I want to say is we can't do really experiments relating to brain tumors on humans, right?
Yeah.
So what biologists have to do is they have to model it with animals, and usually it's a mouse model to begin with, right? And so my supervisor genetically engineered a large number of mice to have mutations in their brain tissue and restrict their mutations to the brain tissue, and the mutations were kind of generated at random in their brain tissue. Now, some of the mice unfortunately got brain tumors, and some of the mice didn't. And after doing that experiment, he was able to sequence the brain tissue from the mice and identify mutations. And kind of what I was saying is earlier, and what I did in that case is I looked at the sequencing data, and okay, we have maybe 30 mice that have brain tumors, and maybe each mice has 30 or 100 different mutations in their genome, the ones that have tumors, but if 30 mice have brain tumors, some of the mutations they have may be the same, some of them may be different. And so bioinformaticians or doing computational biology, what our job would be to do is to figure out which of the mutations are common between the mice that developed brain tumors, and then also for example, looking at human patient data and figuring out, okay, from the data we have about patients that have brain tumors, are there also genes that are commonly mutated in those human patients? Mm-hmm. And then from that kind of analysis, trying to come up with a few candidate driver cancer genes. So there may be genes that are mutated in the brain tumor but not really driving the cancer.
Right.
But trying to tease out what are the driver cancer genes and then studying those further in a lab, which means so for example, my supervisor found FOXR2 And to study that, you take FOXR2 and you overexpress it in cells and see what happens. For example, if you increase the expression of that gene, FOXR2, do the cells start proliferating? Do they start growing faster?
So let me understand. You have a hypothesis, right? You study patterns. So just to back up a little bit, you study patterns of gene sequence mutations that have also not necessarily caused, but have there's also a history of a tumor in that animal or that patient, and then you look across the patterns. You pull out from that some hypotheses, and you test those hypotheses in the lab by exemplify or over exaggerating those particular mutations within each, or modeling it, or within going back to the lab and testing that out in animals as well, and seeing if that then is replicable, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
But I want to just say there's a couple issues with that whole process. And that's why it's really hard to really figure out these things really clearly. Is why the mouse model is not always a great model of the human. So some of the insights you may find out that cause mouse brain cancer may not cause human brain cancer, for example. And then a lot of the experiments biologists have to do, like I said, taking a cell culture, for example, and genetically engineering a cell culture. Well, a cell culture doesn't perfectly model the cellular matrix, which is the kind of 3D environment in your body that you have in your body. So a lot of some of the insights that are drawn from biology research don't really apply or reflect 100% accurately what's going on in the human. If that makes sense.
Yeah, completely. And it's very difficult, as particularly if you go back to brain tumors and brain cancer, it's a very difficult cancer to get data on, isn't it? Because, I mean, even, for example, if you had a tumor in any other part of the body, you could easily open it up and take a sample, right? But it's not so easy when it's inside somebody's head, right? Literally, from a practical standpoint, they don't know. I mean, doctors don't know until they actually open you up and have a look inside whether or not there's actually that tumor is actually malignant, right? And that's difficult for your kind of research, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, excellent, good. Okay, so we've got a 101 there, thanks to Eli. Let's sort of move that forward a little bit. You're based in Tokyo, Japan. You're originally from the West Side. You're from California in the US. Why does it make sense to do what you're doing in Tokyo? One would have thought that, if you are in any kind of high-tech industry, especially being a startup as well, it would make sense to be in California because you've access to capital, you have access to talent, and, you've access to a global market, effectively. But you've chosen Japan. How does that all add up? Can you give us a little bit of background there?
Yeah, so if I can go back even to when I was doing my master's and start from there, Can I start from all the way back then?
Go. Yeah, exactly. We need to know.
Yeah, so I was doing my master's in computer engineering in San Francisco, and I really enjoyed the work I was doing, but I could also see that the career path I was on was very well defined, and the industry was pretty mature. And during my master's, I started to read some academic papers about people applying transistor semiconductor technology to bio applications, and including making sensors from transistors that sense something biological. And also, I read some early papers about using semiconductor technology for doing DNA sequencing. And so that started me, kind of got my interest into biology going. But it was a bit early. So 6 years ago, biotech and all this stuff obviously wasn't as hot or mainstream as it is now. But I kind of felt that it was the future. And so I wanted to learn more about biology. But it was hard to find a place for me where I could learn really a lot of about biology with my background being in computer engineering. And I started learning some biology during my master's, but not a lot. But I was able to find a researcher at a university me joining the lab if I could get into the university. So I had a good opportunity to really learn a lot about bio here. And Japan actually has a lot of great research in bio. It's the discoverer, or he's kind of an engineer, I would say, as well, of iPS cells, which is creating stem cells from skin cells. Was Japanese, right? And so I just want to say, Japan has a good biotech research. It's a good place for biotech research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Cool. What about in terms of the actual Japanese market itself? I mean, Japan is very strong on the research side in many industries, especially in technology. What about the fact that you're in Japan, and Japan has these unique, I suppose, demographic challenges, and we're witnessing now. Yeah, so Japan has this aging population, which basically means, as far as I understand, as a layman, that you're going to have more incidences of the kind of diseases that you're studying, right? That's how I understand it, especially for something like cancer. Older population, it's more relevant. And then also you have this situation where, you have a declining population as well. I mean, the population in Japan is predicted to decline from 125 to maybe 90 million by 2050. So you have a changing population pyramid as well. So, there's going to be less focus maybe on the kind of diseases associated or the kind of conditions associated with a younger population. So doing what you're doing, how is that relevant to actually being in Japan and the unique challenges that it faces?
I hadn't really so I guess the first response is Japan is very proactive about being at the edge of cancer treatments, even though we're not we're not making like medical equipment or anything for cancer treatment. We're not a drug company, but Japan has a ton of new machines for using the new methods of cancer treatment that use some kind of form of ion therapy or radiation. I forgot how they work, but so I think Japan will adopt therapeutic methods for various diseases very quickly. But I think also really just for our company, the reason why I ended up working on a company here is I ended up finding my co-founders here. And I think we'll spend extended time in the U.S. My co-founder is going to Boston this month, and I'll go to the States next month as well. And as you said, Japan has these issues, and we both agreed that they have great research, but I would like to see better commercialization of technology and more support and industry growth in Japan for biotech. So I visited Singapore in June, and I was super impressed by how fast they move and the kind of government support they have for new companies and just doing research. So for example, they have a synthetic DNA research foundry, so that they're doing a lot of research in our area. And Japan has yet to adopt the same kind of research center. Do
you think you'll be more involved with places like Singapore in the future?
Yeah, so for me, also from that conference, I got to see some of the things that they're doing in China, and I really think that China, Singapore, U.S., UK, they're going to be really, really strong markets and just players in biotech and synthetic biology. And so I definitely, don't want to be out of the loop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Switching gears a little bit here, Eli. Okay, so I know you're in biotech and you describe yourself as being involved in that industry, but with your background, what I'm curious about, you're an electrical engineer by training. We've kind of touched upon it already, but I'm really curious about this overlap between electrical engineering and what you're doing in biology. Because it's a bit of context here. My background is artificial intelligence. I studied AI in the mid-90s, which was, well, pretty much an academic pursuit only back then. And it's very different now, and there's so much funding in the industry. But it's fascinating that what started out as, effectively a computational discipline, so computational psychology, cognitive psychology, and so on, artificial intelligence drew a lot of its real progress when it started getting hooked up with biology. Because then people realized actually a lot of the problems that we were trying to solve through computational modeling had already been solved in the real world, right? Biology and evolutionary biology, for example, had a lot of the answers. So what appeared as very disparate disciplines were actually, very interconnected. But it took somebody with a different mindset to be able to see that because, often if you study something and become very good at it, those kind of people only want to do that. And, if you then start talking about biology in the context of that knowledge, it scares some people, isn't it? Because, maybe you trained as an engineer and somebody's coming along with this new bit of information and you have to start again almost, right? You have to start at the bottom of the curve and work your way up to understand this. So curious about your move from being an engineer into biology and really what the driver was and how you sort of see all those linking up because they're not obviously connected to most people.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing is to define in biology, you have research biology, which is trying to figure out which gene, for example, is causing cancer or which the function of the gene, right? So it's a discovery, hypothesis, and testing methodology, and then synthetic biology, which is creating new things from our understanding of research biology. And so research biology and synthetic biology, to me, are just like reverse engineering and engineering in electrical engineering. So in biology, you're just reverse engineering the human body or whatever biological system you're studying, and then synthetic biology, you're engineering something. And I think what's cool is now that our understanding of biology is improving on the research side, we can start to engineer things and also, with improvements in synthetic DNA, that's going to allow us to engineer things even faster. And so I think that's kind of why, like, my background, as you said, like, I really feel like it gives me an advantage because a lot of biologists are only used to reverse engineering something. And also, I think the methodology, like, I had a lot of friction when I entered my lab because, as you said, like, kind of people get stuck doing something one way and thinking one way. And sometimes, someone from another background looks at things differently.
That's what I'm curious about. That really fascinates me because, what's in my head is thinking, does an engineer think about that problem differently to how a biologist would? So when you approach any of the medical problems that you're dealing with, would you, from your training, from what you've learned from a young age, do you go about that problem differently to a trained biologist?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have so many examples. So, let's see. I think biologists, they're okay. Like, so I think you kind of get people get into habits, and so, for example, you start doing one methodology and you get one hit out of 10 success rate. but maybe that's, fine for your job or something. You may just continue that method. And what I mean is, for example, the thing I was saying earlier about when even you're doing research and you're overexpressing a gene, you're increasing the expressing a gene in a cell line, and then seeing if that cell line grows faster or slower. Even that experiment, like if it's accepted, if you published one paper and that was accepted, you may just continue to use that experiment. But maybe for some reason that experiment is too artificial. It doesn't model what's going on in the body very well. And so I think even just coming from the outside and questioning those methods is really useful, because you're not in the habit of just doing them every day and accepting it, but questioning, why are we doing this? Is this actually modeling what's going on? But then really on the software side, I think, or on the engineering side, like I'm used to using software in engineering regularly, and biologists really aren't used to using a lot of those kind of software tools or programming, right? So when I'm creating our software, I'm thinking about engineering software and how that was made
Yeah, that whole ability to look at a problem from the outside is really interesting, because it's not something that I think necessarily you can train in people through education. It's something that people learn from their own sort of life experience. And it's so important, especially in the area of innovation and what you're doing, that ability to question something and ask why. Because, you ask why because maybe you've seen something else done in a parallel universe, so to speak, which could be in engineering, which works there. And maybe people could use that information in a new discipline, like in bioinformatics, for example. So now we sort of get to the point where we look at your personal background. And here's what's interesting, because I'm sort of want to stay with this riff about coming from the outside. And for the listeners, what they may not appreciate, if we were having a conversation, myself and my co-host, Michael Waits, about Eli Lyons, and looking at your photo on LinkedIn, the natural assumption was, okay, so this guy's in Japan. He was educated in California. He looks like a sort of second-generation Japanese growing up in California, because there's plenty of them, right? And they often adopt, Western or American names like Ken or something like that.
Right.
Right? That's quite common, isn't it? So, but with yourself, Eli Lyons, we're thinking, where does that sort of fit in? That's not really, it would be something like Eli Nakamura or something like that would be more obvious. But then when I spoke to you off tape, we found out you weren't Japanese. Where I'm getting to, I'm coming from the outside thing. I think your sort of upbringing is really interesting. So help people understand first. Let's put this conversation to bed. Firstly, you're not Japanese, and we got that completely wrong, and that's surprising because Michael's lived in Japan 20 years. I live in Japan, married to Japanese, so I can kind of see a Japanese face and understand it's Japanese or not. What's the story?
Right. Well, it's funny that you said you thought my name was pronounced Eli, which is a common mistake in the U.S. and Japan, but even more so in Japan, because sometimes people, like if my name is on a list for some event or something, they think, like Eli-chan, like kawaii, like they think it's a girl. Yeah.
Well, they're disappointed when they see you.
Yeah. Not as cute as they expected. Oh. Yeah. But, so I'm from California, born on the East Coast of the U.S. My mom's of Irish and English background, maybe third or fourth generation American, and my dad's American-born Mexican. And I grew up in California. I guess I studied abroad in Taiwan during university for 3 semesters, and I got to kind of get a sense of what Asia, get some get a sense of what Asia was like, and really living in Asia. And I also had a Japanese roommate for a year in college who I'm still close friends with. It's actually funny. He lives down the street from me now. And so I guess that's really the connection. Yeah, it's not genetic.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's the fascinating part of the whole sort of personal narrative as well, especially with what you're doing. You know, you have come from the outside of biotech. You know, you weren't originally trained in biotech. I know, for example, that you later on took the PhD in genome science, which would qualify you, but you've come from the outside in terms of your engineering side.
Yeah, just to clarify, I'm a PhD like candidate. I haven't officially gotten my degree yet.
Right. But you're in the process, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so you know a bit about genome science. That's what I'm trying to say, right?
Right, yeah.
You're not just an engineer who picked up a book in the library one day. Okay, so you've come from the outside there, and you've come from the outside in terms of, you know, you come to Asia, and it's not easy to crack the Asian market, especially if you don't have the immediate connection. I know you had a roommate who was from from Japan, but that's not, you know, necessarily enough to, you know, get you started in Japan and so on. It's not an easy market to integrate into. So you've come from the outside consciously, which I find fascinating as well. And, you know, do you ever sort of see those patterns in terms of looking at things differently, in terms of solving problems and so on? Do you think that's a sort of a current or a recurrent theme in your life? Are you aware of it even? That's what I'm sort of curious to know.
I guess, yeah, that's a good question. I'm gonna, you know, be doing some psychoanalysis on myself later, I guess.
All right, I've put you on the couch now, so
yeah. But I think, you know, I had a lot of really tough experiences coming from the outside in those two aspects, culturally and academically. So, you know, academically, one of the biggest challenges is that I did both wet lab work and analysis work, and when I was doing my master's, I took like a third year biology course without taking any of the prerequisites, and it was very challenging, but I was able to pass. But I never did any lab work before I came here, and learning to do wet lab work was really tough. And also getting used to the failure associated with doing experiments was something I had not experienced before in engineering. And that was really tough mentally for me. And at the same time, you know, so as an outsider, right? And you know, also like people looking at me and like I'm failing experiments all the time didn't feel good. And at the same time, you know, it was, of course, hard to get used to the different culture, especially in my lab where it's very hierarchical. You know, like I was used to the American kind of lab where like I was like friends with my supervisor, you know. We would maybe go grab a coffee or grab lunch or something, or, you know, just have a chat. But in Japan, I felt that, you know, my supervisor had a lot of power over me. And it was, and also, you know, the relationship was very different, and the decision-making process was very different. And that was hard to get used to. And, you know, I've had a lot of difficult learning experiences like that in school and also, in industry. I was actually at another startup previously, and that was where the other co-founders were all Japanese, and you know, we got along great in some ways, and I had some difficulty in some ways, but you know, those are really tough experiences. But I don't think it's like I can't watch Japanese. Like, you know, most of my investors now are Japanese. And we get along just great. And you know, there's Japanese I work with. My advisors are also Japanese, for our company, and we get along just great. So I don't want to make any specific bad examples or anything. But
No. I mean, it's not Japan you're talking about. It's a new culture, isn't it? This could happen as much in China or Japanese moving to America or whatever. But that point about these difficult experiences, that's what you've consciously chosen. And that really is what's inspiring about your story for anybody thinking of doing the same, isn't it? Because you've got comfortable with being uncomfortable, if that makes sense. You could have easily just stuck out electrical engineering and just become, the name in the field in that. You could have become a professor at university or whatever it is that you could have pursued. You could have built up that knowledge base and that experience and that name and never changed it. But you've consciously stepped out and decided to pursue these challenges where you put yourself in very difficult situations, and one of these things, maybe you don't think about it. Maybe you don't consciously step back and think, yeah, that's me, because it's just kind of what you do. But that's what you've done, right? And that's what other people will look at and say, okay, that's what I need to do. If I'm going to go and start my own startup, I have to be prepared to do this. I have to be prepared to, be a beginner in a sense. I know you're not a complete beginner when you go in because you're bringing in this knowledge, which other people don't have, but to put yourself in a situation where, a lot of people may feel I'm sort of moving backwards in a way, but, that's key to moving forwards long term. And I think that's a really inspiring part of your story, Eli. And maybe one which you don't consciously think about, as I say, but that's kind of like what I see looking from the outside.
Yeah, so I think I certainly did not expect, my story to work out like it has now, exactly like it has now. But at the same time, I did make a conscious decision, right? Like when I was doing my master's, I was like, okay, well, I can finish my master's, I can study PhD in electrical engineering, try and become a professor or a researcher at Intel, or I can finish my master's and I can, work, get an awesome job in the suburbs and have a white picket fence, and none of those things, and kind of do iterative improvements in the industry I'm in. And none of those things just really appealed to me. I did want to challenge myself further. And I did see that there was some kind of trend. It wasn't as super clear to me, but I could see the trend of engineering being applied to biology and vice versa. And so I made a conscious decision in some ways, but I had no idea where it would really lead me.
Yeah, but the story is fascinating altogether, and it's leading you in the right direction. And it's one of those things, I think we talked about it at the beginning of the interview about joining the dots. I know Steve Jobs is always famous for saying that, about it always makes sense when you sort of look back and how things sort of fit together, as if there was a master plan. So when you do tell it, you can tell people as if there was a master plan from day one. This is how it's all going to work out, even though it's a bit more haphazard in reality.
You're going to have to edit the podcast then.
Yeah, exactly. Well, people will work it out, or when you come back on, you kind of got all your story together. But I think it's been fascinating listening to it and inspirational as well. That's Eli Lyons, everybody, the CEO of Tupac Bio. Eli, before we let you go, please share with us some link or links where the listeners can go and find out more about you, because I'm sure they want to find out more about your thing at Tupac Bio, as well as your story as well.
Sure. Our website is www.tupac.bio.
Excellent. And yeah, please come back on in future, Eli, because I think we've only scratched the surface, really. And maybe that's the general theme of your own personal story as well, that it's unwritten, the future, and there's so much more to come, right? So it'd be great to have you back on, because I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you today and also learning a lot about biotech and bioinformatics, and hopefully the listeners enjoyed that too. Feel free to, reach out and find out more about Eli at the link provided. And Eli, thank you so much for today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to Asia Tech Podcast. Find out more at www.asiatechpodcast.com.